The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the towering mansion's marble halls. Inside, a young woman stood trembling, her hands clutching her stomach. Across from her, the man she had once trusted, the father of her unborn child, sat in an expensive leather chair, his expression cold and indifferent. "You can't be serious," he scoffed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You think you can trap me with this?" Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but she refused to break. She had worked in this house for years, cleaning floors and serving meals, never imagining she would fall for its owner, Richard Lawson, a self-made millionaire who had everything but a heart. It started as stolen moments, whispered promises, a love she thought was real. But now, standing before him, she realized how foolish she had been. "I'm not asking for money," Maria said, her voice shaking. "I just thought you'd want to know. This is your child, Richard." Richard scoffed. "And? That's not my problem. You're just the help, Maria. You knew what this was. I'm not about to ruin my life over some mistake." A sharp pain clenched her chest. "A mistake? This is your child." Richard leaned back, smirking. "Not anymore. You have an hour to pack your things. After that, I want you gone. And don't bother coming back." Maria staggered back, gripping her stomach as if shielding her unborn baby from his words. Her mind raced. Where would she go? She had no family nearby, no savings, no place to turn. The walls of the mansion, once a home, now felt like a prison, suffocating her. "Richard, please. I have nowhere." "Not my problem," he cut her off coldly. "I don't owe you anything." The finality in his voice sent a chill through her bones. An hour later, Maria stood outside the mansion gates, her small suitcase soaked by the rain. The world felt heavier than ever before. With nowhere to go and a baby on the way, she turned and walked into the unknown, her heart shattered but her spirit unbroken. As the lights of the mansion faded behind her, she made a silent vow. She would survive. She would protect her child. And one day, Richard Lawson would regret this moment more than he could ever imagine. Years later, fate had something in store for him that he never saw coming. The cold night air bit into Maria's skin as she trudged down the empty sidewalk, her suitcase dragging behind her. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she refused to stop. She had no idea where she was going, only that she could never look back. Her phone battery was nearly dead, and she had less than $100 in her bank account. The weight of her reality settled in. She was homeless, pregnant, and completely alone. She ducked into a bus stop shelter, shivering. The rain had soaked through her thin sweater, and her stomach churned with hunger. She pressed a hand to her belly. "I promise, I'll take care of you," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. Maria had spent years cleaning Richard's home, hearing his guests talk about stocks, business deals, and luxury vacations. Yet, in all that time, she had never been able to save enough to escape the world she was born into. The irony stung. She had served the rich, but now, she had nothing. She pulled out her phone and searched for nearby motels. The cheapest one, $45 a night, was 5 blocks away. Maria hesitated before booking it. "Half my money gone in one night. But what choice do I have?" She gathered her strength and walked the long, wet streets to the motel. When she arrived, the receptionist barely looked up. "$45. Cash or card?" Maria handed over her debit card, flinching when she saw the remaining balance, $52.36. "Checkout's at 11, the receptionist mumbled, tossing her a key. Inside, the room was barely bigger than a closet. The bed sagged, the walls were stained, and the flickering lamp cast eerie shadows. But it was warm, and for now, it was home. She curled up on the bed, hugging her belly. "We'll be okay," she whispered. "I'll find a way." The next morning, Maria woke early, her stomach tight with hunger. She knew she had to find work, fast. She spent hours walking through town, asking for jobs. Every answer was the same: no positions available. No experience. No vacancies. By noon, exhaustion weighed on her like a stone. She sat on a park bench, gripping her belly, panic setting in. I have enough for one more night at the motel. What happens after that? Excuse me, dear, are you okay? Maria looked up. An elderly woman, wrapped in a warm coat, peered at her with concern. Maria hesitated, embarrassed to admit her situation. But something in the woman's kind eyes made her speak. I'm just trying to find work. But no one's hiring. The woman nodded. Times are tough. But I know someone who might need help. Hope flickered in Maria's chest. Really? The woman smiled. Come with me, dear. Let's get you something to eat first. A glimmer of hope. The woman's name was Eleanor. She led Maria to a small diner, where she ordered them both soup and bread. As Maria ate, warmth spread through her for the first time in days. My friend owns a little shop, Eleanor said. She needs help. It's not much, but it's something. Tears pricked Maria's eyes. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. Eleanor squeezed her hand. Just promise me one thing, don't give up. Hard times don't last forever. Maria swallowed back emotion, gripping Eleanor's hand tightly. She wasn't alone anymore. But life had more challenges waiting for her, and a twist that would change everything. Richard Lawson leaned back in his leather chair, sipping an aged whiskey as the city skyline stretched before him. It had been years since that night, since Maria stood before him, pleading, since he had thrown her out without a second thought. And yet, he never thought about her. Not once. Why would he? He had moved on. His company, Lawson Enterprises, had expanded globally. His net worth had tripled. He had everything: wealth, power, a lavish penthouse in the heart of the city. Women came and went. None of them stayed long enough to matter. But that was fine with him. Love was a liability, emotions were distractions. Richard had built his empire with ruthless efficiency, leaving no room for regrets. But something was missing. The hollow victory. Richard's personal assistant, Tom, entered the office. Sir, your schedule for today: board meeting at noon, client dinner at 7. Also, the charity gala is this Friday. Will you be attending? Richard waved a hand dismissively. I don't do charity. Tom hesitated. It's hosted by Eleanor Davis. She's well connected. Could be good PR. Richard exhaled. Eleanor Davis. That name sounded familiar. Fine. Add it to my calendar, he muttered. As Tom left, Richard stared at his reflection in the glass window. He had everything a man could want, yet why did he feel so empty? It was a question he never dared to ask. A haunting reminder. That night, Richard attended a gala filled with the city's elite. He shook hands, made deals, charmed potential investors. But something felt off. He spotted Eleanor Davis, an elderly woman surrounded by young professionals, laughing, radiating warmth. As Richard approached to introduce himself, his breath hitched. She was speaking to someone. A young man, mid-20s, well-dressed, sharp-eyed. There was something familiar about him. Richard narrowed his eyes. The young man had Maria's eyes. The first seed of doubt. Richard's chest tightened, but he brushed off the thought. Coincidence. He left the gala, pushing away the nagging feeling in his gut. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Maria flashed through his mind for the first time in years. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But fate wasn't done with him yet. Because soon, Richard would learn the shocking truth, and regret everything. Maria sat on the edge of a small bed, watching as her son, Daniel, hunched over his schoolbooks, scribbling notes. The warm glow of a single lamp lit the tiny apartment they shared, a far cry from the mansion she once worked in. But it was home. And most importantly, they had each other. A boy with a dream. Daniel had been different from other kids. Where others played, he studied. Where others complained, he worked harder. He knew, even as a child, that his mother had sacrificed everything for him. "Mom, I'll make you proud one day," he would say, eyes burning with determination. And he did. He earned top grades, won scholarships, and pushed himself harder than anyone else. While his classmates partied, he studied. While others gave up, he persisted. Maria watched him grow, pride swelling in her heart. He was nothing like his father. He had his face, his sharp mind, but his heart belonged to her. A stroke of fate. One day, Daniel came home with an envelope in his trembling hands. "Mom. I got into Lawson Academy." Maria's heart stopped. Lawson. The name sent a shiver down her spine. It was his name. Her hands clenched the fabric of her dress as she looked at her son. He was beaming, unaware of the storm raging inside her. "Full scholarship," he continued. "It's the best business program in the country, Mom. This is my chance." Maria forced a smile. "That's incredible, sweetheart." But inside, her past clawed at her, whispering warnings. Would fate really be so cruel? The journey begins. Despite her fears, Maria wouldn't hold her son back. She helped him pack. She hugged him tightly before he left for the academy. "Remember who you are," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "I know, Mom. I'll make you proud." As she watched him leave, Maria swallowed her fear. She had spent years running from the past. But now, it was coming back. And neither she nor Richard Lawson had any idea what was about to happen next. Daniel stepped onto the sprawling campus of Lawson Academy, a place where the children of the wealthy and powerful roamed, oblivious to the struggles of people like him. The academy was more than just a school, it was a direct pipeline to the most elite business circles in the world. He adjusted his backpack, feeling out of place among students wearing designer clothes and driving luxury cars. He wasn't here to fit in. He was here to win. An unlikely standout. Daniel's sharp mind and relentless work ethic quickly made him stand out. Within weeks, professors took notice. He challenged ideas, thought critically, and dominated every business competition. His name spread across campus. One afternoon, a professor approached him after class. "You're impressive, Daniel. Have you ever considered mentorship under Richard Lawson?" Daniel's breath hitched. The name Lawson was something his mother never spoke of, but it lingered in the background of his life like a shadow. He forced himself to remain calm. "Richard Lawson? As in, the CEO of Lawson Enterprises?" The professor nodded. "He personally selects students for internships. You'd be a perfect candidate." Daniel's heart pounded. Could this be fate? The first encounter. A week later, Daniel found himself standing in the towering Lawson Enterprises building, waiting outside a conference room. The door opened. And for the first time in his life, Daniel came face to face with his father. Richard Lawson barely glanced at him as he took a seat at the head of the long table. Daniel studied the man who had abandoned his mother before he was born. Arrogant. Powerful. Cold. But Richard had no idea who Daniel was. The meeting began. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't break, didn't give away a single sign of recognition. Instead, he spoke with confidence, delivering a strategy proposal that left the executive speechless. For the first time in years, Richard Lawson was impressed. When the meeting ended, Richard turned to him. "What's your name again?" Daniel met his gaze without hesitation. "Daniel. Daniel Carter." Richard smirked. "I like you, Carter. Let's see what you're really made of." And just like that, Richard Lawson unknowingly welcomed his own son into his inner circle. But Daniel had a plan. He wasn't here to impress Richard. He was here to make him regret everything. Daniel stood at the massive windows of Lawson Enterprises, looking out at the city skyline. He clenched his fists, the weight of his secret pressing down on him. His father, the man who abandoned his mother, had just welcomed him into his world. Richard Lawson didn't know the truth. Not yet. But he would. Earning Richard's trust. Weeks turned into months. Daniel played his role perfectly. He became one of Richard's most trusted interns, sitting in on high-stakes meetings, learning the secrets of Lawson Enterprises. He outworked every other intern, proving himself to be sharp, strategic, and ruthless, just like Richard. And Richard loved it. "You remind me of myself at your age," Richard said one evening as they shared a drink in his office. Daniel forced a polite smile. If only he knew. A mother's warning. Back home, Maria listened in silence as Daniel told her about his new role. Her face paled. "Daniel, this is dangerous. You don't know what this man is capable of." Daniel frowned. "He's nothing, Mom. He's just a businessman who thinks money can buy everything. But I'm not here to be his protégé. I'm here to make sure he pays for what he did to you." Maria reached for his hand. "Son, revenge is a heavy burden. Don't let it consume you." But Daniel had already made up his mind. Richard Lawson would regret ever throwing Maria away. The first crack in Richard's armor. One afternoon, Daniel was organizing old files when he came across a hidden folder labeled Maria Carter. His breath caught. Inside were documents, records from years ago. Payments. A termination contract. And a letter from Richard to his lawyers. "Ensure Maria Carter never returns. I want her out of my life for good. No financial support. No contact. She is irrelevant." Daniel's blood boiled. His mother had suffered alone while Richard lived like a king. But Richard had no idea his past was about to come back to haunt him. The moment that changed everything. That night, Richard and Daniel attended a high-profile gala together. As they walked through the grand hall, Richard suddenly stopped, his face turning pale. Daniel followed his gaze, and saw his mother standing there. Maria had been invited as a guest of Eleanor Davis, the woman who once saved her. For the first time in decades, Richard and Maria locked eyes. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment Richard's eyes met Maria's across the grand ballroom, the air in the room seemed to shift. The confident, untouchable businessman suddenly felt something he hadn't in years: unease. Maria held her head high, dressed in an elegant yet modest gown. She was no longer the frightened young maid he had thrown out all those years ago. She was strong. Unbroken. Daniel, standing beside Richard, felt his pulse quicken. This was it. His father's perfect world was about to shatter. A face he couldn't ignore. Richard swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. He turned to Daniel. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice clipped. But Daniel didn't move. "Something wrong, sir?" he asked, feigning innocence. Richard's jaw tightened. "No. Just a familiar face." Daniel saw the tension in Richard's shoulders, the flicker of recognition in his eyes. His father was shaken. Good. Maria, however, wasn't going to let Richard run. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "It's been a long time, Richard." Her voice was calm, controlled. But there was steel beneath it. Richard forced a smirk. "Maria. What a surprise." "Is it?" she said, tilting her head. "I heard you don't believe in fate." Daniel watched as his father, a man who commanded billion-dollar deals without blinking, suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. The truth spills out. Eleanor Davis, the host of the gala and Maria's dear friend, suddenly spoke up. "You two know each other?" she asked, glancing between them. Maria smiled, but her eyes held fire. "Oh, yes. Richard and I have history." Richard's fingers tightened around his drink. "Let's not do this here." Maria crossed her arms. "Why not? You weren't afraid to do it all those years ago, in front of everyone." Eleanor frowned. "Maria, what are you talking about?" Maria's gaze didn't waver. "Richard Lawson is the man who threw me out into the street when I was pregnant with his child." The room went silent. All around them, people turned to listen. Curious whispers spread through the crowd. Daniel's chest burned with anger and satisfaction. This was his moment. He took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "And that child, Richard?" Daniel said, looking his father dead in the eyes. "That was me." Richard's world crumbles. Richard turned sharply to Daniel, his face frozen in shock. "What?" he whispered. Maria nodded. "Meet your son, Richard. The one you abandoned before he was even born." Richard's breathing grew uneven. His sharp businessman's mind, so used to control, failed to process the truth. Daniel stepped closer. "You built this empire, but you left us to struggle. You lived in luxury while my mother worked herself to the bone. And the best part?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "You took me under your wing. You taught me your business. You told me I reminded you of yourself." Richard's throat bobbed as realization set in. His own flesh and blood had been right beside him this whole time. And he never even knew. Regret hits hard. Richard's hands shook slightly as he set his glass down. For the first time in his life, words failed him. Maria's voice softened, but the weight of years of pain carried through. "You left us with nothing, Richard. But we survived. Daniel survived. And now? He's standing here, more successful than you could ever imagine. Without your money. Without your name." Richard swallowed hard. "I didn't know." Maria's eyes flashed. "You didn't care." Richard turned back to Daniel, searching for the right words. But Daniel wasn't done. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and deadly calm. "I could destroy you right now," he said. "One press conference. One interview. And your perfect reputation, gone." Richard's lips parted, his face ashen. "But I won't," Daniel continued, surprising everyone. Maria's eyes widened. "Daniel." Daniel shook his head. "I don't need revenge. You've already lost, Richard." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" Daniel's next words cut deeper than any business loss Richard had ever faced. "You built an empire. But at the end of the day, you have no one." Richard's breath caught. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had power, money, status, but no family. No one who loved him. And that was a pain no amount of wealth could fix. A man left in the shadows. The whispers in the room grew louder. Some people looked at Richard with disgust. Others with pity. Maria turned to Daniel. "Let's go." Daniel nodded, giving Richard one last look before walking away with his mother. And for the first time in his life, Richard Lawson, the man who once thought he was untouchable, felt truly, utterly alone. But was it too late for redemption? Or was fate giving him one last chance? Richard Lawson sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights flickering through the massive glass windows. But tonight, for the first time in years, his empire meant nothing. His mind replayed the events of the gala over and over. Maria. Daniel. His son. He had spent years building a fortune, ensuring his legacy, yet the one thing that truly mattered had slipped through his fingers. He had a son. And he had thrown him away. A desperate attempt. The next morning, Richard's hands trembled as he dialed a number. Maria's. It rang. And rang. And rang. Then, voicemail. He tried again. And again. No answer. His gut tightened. He had faced hostile takeovers, lawsuits, and financial collapses, but nothing terrified him more than the thought that he had lost them forever. But Richard Lawson had never been a man who gave up. So he did the only thing he could. He went to her. A door slammed in his face. Maria's apartment was in an old but well-kept building. The kind of place he had never stepped foot in. He knocked. Nothing. Knocked again. Footsteps. Then, Maria opened the door. Her eyes hardened the moment she saw him. "You have some nerve coming here," she said. Richard swallowed. "Maria, please. I just want to talk." Maria stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine." She stepped aside. But when Richard entered, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. The life he missed. The walls were lined with photos. Daniel as a baby, cradled in Maria's arms. Daniel as a boy, reading books bigger than his head. Daniel graduating high school, Maria beaming with pride. Richard's throat tightened. He had missed everything. "This is what you threw away," Maria said quietly. Regret burned in his chest like acid. "Maria," he started, his voice rough, "I was wrong. I was a coward. And I." The front door swung open. Daniel stood there, eyes dark with fury. What the hell is he doing here? The final blow. Maria flinched. "Daniel, he just wanted to talk." Daniel scoffed. "Talk? The man who abandoned us wants to talk." Richard took a shaky breath. "Son, please. Don't call me that," Daniel snapped. The room went silent. Richard's chest ached. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. I know I failed. But if I could take it back." "You can't," Daniel cut him off. Silence stretched between them. Then Daniel spoke, his voice ice cold. "You think saying sorry makes up for years of pain? You think you can just walk in here and fix everything with money and apologies?" Richard shook his head. "No. I know I can't. But I can try. If you let me." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Try? Where were you when my mother was working double shifts just to feed me? Where were you when I needed a father? Where were you when we had nothing?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. Daniel's voice cracked. "You weren't there. And you can't change that." Maria placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Daniel." But Daniel wasn't done. "You know what the saddest part is?" he whispered. Richard braced himself. "I looked up to you," Daniel admitted, voice shaking. "Before I knew who you were, I actually admired you. I wanted to be like you." His lips curled in disgust. "But now? I see you for what you are. And I want nothing to do with you." Richard's breath caught. Maria's eyes filled with tears. "You made your choice years ago," Daniel said, stepping back toward the door. "Now live with it." Then he was gone. And for the first time in his life, Richard Lawson, the man who thought he had it all, realized he had nothing. But was this truly the end? Or did fate have one final lesson for him? Richard Lawson sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. The same city where he had built his empire. The same city where his son had grown up without him. For the first time in his life, money couldn't fix what was broken. He had faced rejection before. He had lost deals, companies, even friendships. But nothing compared to the ache in his chest now. His son, his own flesh and blood, wanted nothing to do with him. And he couldn't blame him. A man without a legacy. The following weeks were a blur. For the first time, work didn't matter. The boardroom meetings felt meaningless. The deals felt empty. Everywhere he went, he saw Daniel's face. On TV. In business magazines. Rising through the ranks, making a name for himself, without the Lawson name. Daniel was succeeding on his own. And Richard? He had never felt more alone. A mother's final words. One evening, after another long, empty day, Richard's phone rang. Maria. His heart pounded as he picked up. Maria? A long pause. Then, her voice, soft but firm. Richard, you need to stop waiting for Daniel to come to you. Richard swallowed. He made himself clear. He doesn't want anything to do with me. Because you haven't shown him you deserve a second chance. Richard exhaled shakily. How do I do that? Maria sighed. You can't buy his forgiveness, Richard. You have to earn it. Show him the father he never had. Richard hesitated. And if he never forgives me? Maria's voice was quiet. Then at least he'll know you tried. A grand gesture, or a true effort. The old Richard Lawson would have sent a check. A house. A business investment. But Daniel wasn't interested in money. He wanted to see who Richard really was. And so, for the first time in his life, Richard humbled himself. He showed up at the community center where Daniel mentored underprivileged kids. He sat in the back of business seminars Daniel hosted. He volunteered at the same charities Maria had once relied on. And he never once asked for recognition. The moment that changed everything. One evening, as Richard helped clean up after a charity event, a familiar voice rang out behind him. You don't belong here. Richard turned. Daniel stood there, arms crossed, eyes cold. I'm not here to make you uncomfortable, Richard said calmly. I'm here because I want to be better. Daniel scoffed. You think volunteering makes up for years of abandonment? Richard shook his head. No. Nothing can. But it's a start. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel sighed. Why now? Why do you care all of a sudden? Richard looked his son in the eyes. Because I realized that all the money, power, and success in the world mean nothing if you have no one to share it with. Daniel's jaw tightened. You're too late. Richard nodded slowly. Maybe. But I'm still here. A long pause. Then, Daniel didn't walk away. He didn't forgive. He didn't embrace his father. But he stayed. And for the first time, Richard felt a flicker of hope. The final lesson. Over time, Richard kept showing up. No grand gestures. No expectations. Just a man trying to earn back the family he lost. And one day, months later, as they sat in a quiet cafe, Daniel finally spoke the words Richard never thought he'd hear. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, Daniel admitted. Richard nodded. I understand. But. Daniel hesitated. I think we can try to start over. Richard's throat tightened. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. That's more than I could ever ask for. The meaning of true wealth. Richard Lawson had spent his life chasing wealth. But in the end, he learned that real riches weren't in money, but in the people you love. And as he sat across from his son, sharing their first real conversation, he knew. He was finally becoming the man he should have been all along. Final message. Sometimes, regret is the price of wisdom. But if you're willing to change, it's never too late to fight for what truly matters. Red Heart.